in the shadow of ancient mountains, where the golden light of dawn first touched the walls of Jerusalem, a story unfolded that would echo through the corridors of time. This is not merely a tale of war and conquest, but a profound testament to divine intervention, unwavering faith, and the ultimate triumph of righteousness over tyranny. Picture, if you will, the year 701 BC. The world was a vastly different place where empires rose and fell like the tide, and where the clash of bronze and iron determined the fate of nations. In this turbulent era, the kingdom of Judah stood as a small beacon of monotheistic faith, surrounded by mighty pagan empires that sought to extinguish its light forever. The cobblestone streets of Jerusalem bore witness to the daily prayers of a people who had not forgotten their covenant with the Almighty. Children played in the narrow alleys while their mothers ground grain and their fathers worked their trades, all under the watchful eye of King Hezekiah, a ruler whose heart burned with devotion to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But darkness was gathering on the horizon, a shadow that would test the very foundations of their faith and challenge everything they believed about divine protection and human power. Yet, in the face of such overwhelming odds, the people of Judah maintained their faith. In countless homes throughout the kingdom, families gathered each evening to recite the Shema, the ancient declaration of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. They told their children the stories of Abraham's faith, of Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh, of David's victory over Goliath, reinforcing the belief that their God was mightier than any earthly power. The prophet Isaiah moved through the streets of Jerusalem like a living embodiment of divine authority. His words carried the weight of heaven, and when he spoke, even the most skeptical listened with attention. He had been prophesying for over 40 years, having received his calling in the year that King Uzziah died, when he saw the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up with seraphim crying, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. Isaiah's message was complex and multifaceted. On one hand, he proclaimed God's judgment against the sins of Judah, warning that their unfaithfulness had consequences that not even their covenant status could entirely shield them from. On the other hand, he delivered promises of divine protection for those who remained faithful, assuring them that the plans of their enemies would ultimately come to nothing. In the marketplace, elderly men who remembered the prosperity of King Uzziah's reign would gather in the shade of the city gates to discuss the current crisis. Their withered hands gestured expressively as they debated strategy and recalled the military victories of previous generations. Some advocated for alliance with Egypt, reasoning that the Pharaoh's armies, though weakened, might still provide a counterbalance to Assyrian power. Others insisted that only strict adherence to the covenant and complete trust in divine intervention could save them. The younger generation, those who had grown up hearing tales of Assyrian invincibility, often struggled with doubt. How could their small kingdom, with its modest army and limited resources, hope to stand against the greatest military force the world had ever known? Some whispered that perhaps the time had come to follow the example of so many other nations and submit to Assyrian rule, hoping that tribute and vassalage might preserve some measure of autonomy. But King Hezekiah had made his choice. In the innermost chambers of his palace, surrounded by his most trusted advisers, he had declared his intention to resist Assyrian domination regardless of the cost. This decision was not born of political calculation or military confidence, but of spiritual conviction. He believed with every fiber of his being that the God who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt would not abandon his people in their hour of greatest need. The king's faith was not blind optimism, but was grounded in a deep understanding of Israel's history and God's character. He had studied the scrolls of the law and the prophets, meditating on the promises made to David about his dynasty and the assurances given to Solomon about the temple. He knew that God had proven himself faithful in the past, and he staked everything on the belief that divine faithfulness would not fail in the present crisis. This faith was tested daily by the harsh realities of the political situation. Intelligence reports brought increasingly alarming news of Assyrian preparations. Spies reported massive troop movements, the construction of new siege engines, and the stockpiling of supplies for a major campaign. The net was closing around Judah, and everyone knew it. In the temple, the priests offered sacrifices with increased fervor, their prayers taking on an urgency that reflected the national mood. The smoke of burnt offerings rose continuously from the bronze altar, carrying with it the hopes and fears of an entire people. The high priest, in his elaborate vestments, made intercession for the kingdom with a solemnity that impressed even the most casual observers. The Psalms took on new meaning during this period when the temple singers chanted, "God is our refuge and strength, a very present help in trouble." The words resonated with an immediacy that earlier generations might not have fully appreciated. When they sang, "The Lord of hosts is with us, the God of Jacob is our refuge," it was not mere liturgy, but desperate hope. Trade with neighboring countries had virtually ceased, as merchants became unwilling to risk their caravans on roads that might soon become battlefields. The economy of Judah, while not collapsing entirely, showed clear signs of strain. Prices for imported goods rose steadily, while exports dwindled as potential customers prepared for war or conquest. Despite these pressures, or perhaps because of them, there was a notable increase in religious observance throughout the kingdom. Synagogues in smaller towns reported higher attendance at services, and the number of pilgrims coming to Jerusalem for the festivals increased rather than decreased. It was as if the approaching danger had stripped away the non-essentials of life and focused people's attention on what truly mattered. The city walls of Jerusalem, ancient and weathered, stood as a physical reminder of both protection and limitation. Built and rebuilt over centuries, strengthened by various kings, they represented the best that human engineering could provide. Yet everyone who looked upon them knew that if the Assyrians came in force, stone and mortar alone would not be sufficient to preserve the city. King Hezekiah had undertaken extensive fortification projects during his reign. The water supply had been secured through the construction of a remarkable tunnel that brought water from the Gihon spring to a pool inside the city walls. This engineering marvel, carved through solid rock by teams working from both ends, ensured that Jerusalem could withstand a prolonged siege without dying of thirst. But water and walls, however impressive, could not address the fundamental disparity in military power. The Assyrian army was not just larger than anything Judah could field. It was qualitatively different. Where the armies of Judah were essentially militias called up in time of need, the Assyrians maintained a professional military machine that was constantly training, constantly improving, constantly adapting to new challenges. Assyrian military science was centuries ahead of its contemporaries. Their engineers had perfected the art of siege warfare, developing battering rams, siege towers, and mining techniques that could breach any known fortification. Their archers used composite bows that could send arrows farther and with more force than traditional weapons. Their cavalry was trained to fight as coordinated units rather than as individual warriors. Perhaps most importantly, the Assyrian military was backed by a sophisticated logistical system that could support extended campaigns far from home. They had mastered the art of living off the land while simultaneously maintaining supply lines that stretched across hundreds of miles. This meant that they could sustain a siege longer than their enemies could endure it, gradually starving defenders into submission. The people of Judah were well aware of these military realities, yet they maintained their faith and their resolve. In part, this was due to the leadership of King Hezekiah, whose personal piety and unwavering trust in God provided a model for his subjects to follow. But it was also rooted in their understanding of their unique relationship with the divine. Unlike the gods of other nations who were seen as limited in power and geography, the God of Israel was understood to be the creator and ruler of all existence. He was not bound by the normal rules of warfare or politics. He could intervene in human affairs in ways that defied natural explanation. This belief, deeply embedded in the collective consciousness of Judah, provided a foundation of hope that mere military analysis could never supply. The stories of their ancestors reinforced this confidence. They remembered how God had parted the Red Sea to allow the Israelites to escape from Egypt. They recalled how the walls of Jericho had fallen at the blast of trumpets. They treasured the account of David's victory over Goliath when a shepherd boy with a sling had defeated a giant warrior whom the entire Israelite army feared to face. These were not merely ancient tales to them, but living proof of God's power and willingness to intervene on behalf of his people. Each story was a promise that what had happened before could happen again, that divine power was not limited by human expectations or military probabilities. Yet faith did not eliminate anxiety entirely. In the quiet hours of the night when the city slept, and only the watchmen moved along the walls, even the most devout sometimes wrestled with doubt. The disparity between their situation and their beliefs was so vast that it required constant effort to maintain hope. This internal struggle, fought in the privacy of individual hearts, was perhaps as significant as any external battle. The religious leaders of Judah understood this psychological dimension of the crisis and addressed it through intensified teaching and worship. The prophet Isaiah, in particular, delivered a series of oracles that directly addressed the current situation, providing both warnings and encouragements that spoke to the specific fears and hopes of his contemporaries. One of Isaiah's most powerful messages during this period was his declaration that the plans of the nations would come to nothing, that those who plotted against God's people were fighting against God himself. He proclaimed that the Assyrian king, for all his power and arrogance, was merely an instrument in God's hand, and that when God's purpose was accomplished, even this mighty empire would face judgment. These prophetic words provided a framework for understanding the crisis that transcended mere political or military analysis. They suggested that what appeared to be a purely human conflict was actually part of a larger spiritual drama in which the ultimate outcome was already determined by divine decree. This perspective allowed the people of Judah to maintain hope even in the face of seemingly impossible odds. The children of Jerusalem, too young to fully understand the political complexities of the situation, nevertheless absorbed the atmosphere of tension and anticipation. Their games began to incorporate elements of siege and defense, of heroes and villains, of divine intervention and miraculous deliverance. In their innocent play, they rehearsed the very themes that occupied their parents' waking hours. The current object of their attention was a relatively small territory. On the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, the kingdom of Judah. On the grand scale of the Assyrian Empire, it was barely significant, a tiny remnant of what had once been the unified kingdom of Israel and Judah. But its symbolic importance far exceeded its military or economic value. Judah represented something that Sennacherib found intolerable: successful resistance to Assyrian authority. Over the past 3 years, King Hezekiah had refused to pay tribute, had formed alliances with Egypt and other enemies of Assyria, and had encouraged rebellion throughout the Assyrian provinces of the Levant. This defiance could not be allowed to continue, for it threatened the very foundation of Assyrian imperial policy. The Assyrian system of government was built upon the principle of absolute submission. Client kingdoms were expected to provide regular tribute military support when requested and complete obedience to imperial directives. In exchange, they were allowed to maintain their local customs and a degree of internal autonomy. But this arrangement only worked if every vassal understood that disobedience would be met with swift and terrible retribution. Hezekiah's rebellion had already had consequences that reached far beyond the borders of Judah. Cities throughout the empire were watching to see how Sennacherib would respond. If the rebellion succeeded, or even if it was suppressed with insufficient severity, it could spark a war of revolts that might threaten the entire imperial structure. This was not a risk that any Assyrian king could accept. General Tartan, Sennacherib's chief military advisor, approached the map and pointed to the strategic positions surrounding Judah. A veteran of 30 years of campaigning, his weathered face bore the marks of countless battles, and his missing left eye served as a permanent reminder of the siege of Damascus. Despite his injuries, or perhaps because of them, he commanded absolute respect from both his superiors and his subordinates. "My lord," Tartan began, his voice carrying the authority of long experience, "the preliminary intelligence reports from our advanced scouts have been completed. Judah's military capabilities are, as expected, negligible compared to our forces. Their entire army could not match a single one of our corps in either numbers or equipment." He gestured toward a detailed tactical map that showed the topography around Jerusalem. The city was built on a series of hills which provided natural defensive advantages, but also created vulnerabilities that experienced besiegers could exploit. The water supply, always crucial in siege warfare, had been studied extensively by Assyrian engineers. However, Tartan continued, "we should not underestimate the psychological factor. The Jews have a reputation for fanatical resistance when they believe their God is protecting them. They will fight with the desperation of the cornered, and desperate enemies can sometimes achieve results that exceed their apparent capabilities. Sennacherib nodded thoughtfully. He had learned through hard experience that overconfidence was one of the few things that could still threaten Assyrian military supremacy. Each campaign required careful planning and overwhelming force regardless of the apparent weakness of the enemy. "What of their fortifications?" the king asked. "I assume Jerusalem is well defended, or Hezekiah would not have dared to rebel." General Rabshakeh, the king's chief intelligence officer, stepped forward with a scroll containing detailed observations from Assyrian spies who had been operating in Jerusalem for months. His network of informants stretched throughout the known world, and very little that happened in enemy capitals escaped his attention. "The city walls are ancient, but have been strengthened recently," Rabshakeh reported. "Hezekiah has undertaken extensive building projects, including the construction of a water tunnel that connects the city to its primary spring. This means they can withstand a longer siege than might otherwise be expected." He unrolled the scroll revealing detailed drawings of Jerusalem's defensive positions. The sketches showed not only the physical layout of the fortifications, but also the locations of armories, food storage facilities, and likely defensive positions. The intelligence was remarkably comprehensive testament to the efficiency of the Assyrian espionage network. "More or significantly," Rabshakeh continued, "Hezekiah has been stockpiling food and weapons for over a year. Our sources indicate that the city could sustain a siege of 6 months or more provided they maintain discipline and avoid panic among the population." This information did not discourage Sennacherib, but rather pleased him. A quick victory, while militarily satisfying, would not provide the psychological impact he was seeking. A prolonged siege that ended in total destruction would send a much clearer message to other potential rebels throughout the empire. "And what of their allies?" the king inquired. "What support can they expect from Egypt or the Philistine cities?" General Tartan consulted another set of intelligence reports. "Egypt has promised military support, but their army is in poor condition. The pharaoh's forces have been weakened by internal conflicts and would be unlikely to arrive in time to affect the outcome of a siege. As for the Philistine cities, most have already submitted to us. Those that remain independent lack the strength to provide meaningful assistance." This assessment aligned with Sennacherib's own understanding of the regional balance of power. Egypt, once the dominant force in the ancient Near East, had been declining for centuries and was now little more than a shadow of its former greatness. The Philistine city-states, while traditionally hostile to Israel and Judah, were too small and too disunited to pose any real threat to Assyrian operations. The king turned his attention to the logistical aspects of the campaign. Moving an army of the size he was contemplating would require months of preparation and a supply train that stretched for miles. The Assyrian military machine was capable of such operations, but they required careful coordination and substantial resources. "How many men do you recommend for this campaign?" Sennacherib asked his generals. General Tartan considered the question carefully. "For a city the size of Jerusalem, with the defenses they possess, I would recommend no fewer than 150,000 men. This would allow us to completely surround the city while maintaining reserves for unexpected contingencies." The number was staggering by the standards of ancient warfare. Most armies of the period numbered in the thousands rather than tens of thousands. But the Assyrian Empire could field forces of this magnitude because it drew upon a population of millions and had developed the administrative systems necessary to support such large military operations. And siege equipment, the king continued. We will need at least 50 siege towers, 200 battering rams, and countless scaling ladders, Tartan replied. Our engineers estimate it will take 3 months to construct the necessary equipment once we arrive at Jerusalem. But once the siege begins in earnest, the city cannot hold out for more than a few weeks. Sennacherib was pleased with these projections, but he was thinking beyond the purely military aspects of the campaign. The siege of Jerusalem was not just about conquering a rebellious city. It was about making a statement that would echo throughout his empire and beyond. The destruction of Jerusalem needed to be so complete, so horrifying, that no other vassal would dare consider rebellion for generations to come. I want this campaign to be remembered for 1,000 years, the king declared. When we take Jerusalem, I want its destruction to be so thorough that future generations will point to its ruins as proof of what happens to those who defy Assyrian power. The very name Jerusalem should become synonymous with the folly of resistance. His generals nodded in understanding. They had participated in such campaigns before and knew exactly what their king expected. The Assyrian military did not simply conquer cities, it erased them from existence, scattering their populations to the winds and leaving only rubble as a monument to imperial power. But Sennacherib was also a student of psychological warfare, and he understood that sometimes the threat of destruction could be even more effective than destruction itself. A city that surrendered after witnessing the fate of its neighbors could become a valuable asset to the empire, contributing taxes and manpower for future campaigns. A city that had been reduced to ash contributed nothing. Before we begin the actual siege, the king decided, we will offer Hezekiah one final opportunity to surrender. The terms will be generous enough to demonstrate our magnanimity, but the consequences of refusal will be made absolutely clear. Sometimes the anticipation of horror can accomplish what horror itself cannot. This decision reflected the sophisticated understanding of human psychology that made Sennacherib such an effective ruler. He had learned that fear was often more powerful than force, and that enemies who submitted voluntarily were more likely to remain loyal than those who had been crushed into submission. The preparation for the campaign would take months, but the psychological warfare could begin immediately. Sennacherib ordered his scribes to prepare messages that would be sent to every major city in the region, describing in vivid detail what had happened to other nations that had dared to resist Assyrian authority. These messages would inevitably reach Jerusalem, creating anxiety and doubt among the population. At the same time, Assyrian diplomats would approach key figures in Hezekiah's government, offering them generous terms for betraying their king. While such efforts rarely succeeded completely, they often created enough suspicion and paranoia to weaken enemy resolve when the actual fighting began. The king also ordered increased activity along Judah's borders. Assyrian patrols would raid outlying settlements, capturing livestock and taking prisoners. These operations served multiple purposes. They provided intelligence about enemy capabilities. They disrupted Judah's economic activities, and they created a constant state of tension that would wear down civilian morale. Meanwhile, in the workshops of Nineveh, thousands of craftsmen began the massive task of creating the instruments of siege warfare. Carpenters shaped the timbers that would become siege towers and battering rams. Blacksmiths forged the iron reinforcements that would protect these engines from enemy fire. Rope makers twisted the cables that would operate the great catapults. The scale of these preparations was itself a form of psychological warfare. Merchants and travelers passing through Nineveh would inevitably see the vast military preparations and would carry reports of them throughout the region. These reports would eventually reach Jerusalem, where they would contribute to the growing sense of impending doom. Sennacherib took personal interest in every aspect of the preparations. He reviewed the designs for new siege engines, tested new types of armor and weapons, and consulted with his engineers about the most effective ways to breach Jerusalem's walls. This was not mere diligence, but genuine enthusiasm. He found warfare intellectually stimulating and took pride in the technical innovations that gave his army its decisive advantages. The king also spent considerable time studying intelligence reports about the political situation within Judah. He knew that Hezekiah's support was not universal, that there were factions within the kingdom that favored accommodation with Assyria. If these groups could be encouraged and strengthened, they might be able to overthrow Hezekiah, or at least open the gates of Jerusalem when the siege began. Religious intelligence was particularly important in this case. Unlike most of the nations that Assyria had conquered, Judah was unified by a distinctive religious system that seemed to strengthen rather than weaken resistance to foreign domination. The Assyrian intelligence services had studied this phenomenon extensively, trying to understand how religious belief could be turned into a military weakness. The report suggested that the Jews believed their God would protect them from any earthly power, no matter how great. This belief had the potential to inspire fanatical resistance, but it also created a vulnerability. If their God failed to protect them, their morale would collapse completely. The key was to create a situation where divine protection appeared to be absent, where the Jewish people would be forced to conclude that their God had abandoned them. This analysis led to a crucial decision about the conduct of the siege. Rather than attempting a quick assault that might allow the defenders to claim divine intervention if they succeeded in repelling it, Sennacherib would conduct a methodical siege that would gradually erode both the physical defenses of the city and the spiritual confidence of its inhabitants. The siege would begin with a massive show of force designed to overwhelm the psychological defenses of the city before the physical assault even commenced. Tens of thousands of Assyrian soldiers would parade before the walls, displaying their weapons and standards in a carefully choreographed demonstration of imperial might. The sight of such an enormous army would make it clear to every defender that they were facing forces beyond anything they could reasonably hope to resist. At the same time, Assyrian engineers would begin the construction of siege works that would gradually encircle the city. These fortifications would serve a dual purpose. They would prevent any escape or relief attempts, and they would demonstrate the methodical, inexorable nature of Assyrian military science. Day by day, the circle would tighten, and the defenders would watch their situation become increasingly hopeless. Throughout this process, Assyrian heralds would repeatedly offer terms for surrender, each offer slightly less generous than the previous one. This would create internal pressure within the city, as different factions debated whether to accept terms while they were still available or to continue a resistance that seemed increasingly futile. The psychological dimension of the campaign was as carefully planned as the military dimension. Sennacherib understood that breaking the will of the enemy was often more important than breaking their physical defenses, and he had developed techniques for psychological warfare that were as sophisticated as his military technology. But the king also recognized that he was dealing with an enemy unlike any he had faced before. The Jewish faith seemed to provide a source of strength that was difficult to undermine through conventional psychological pressure. Their belief in divine protection was so deeply rooted that it might persist even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This presented both a challenge and an opportunity. If Sennacherib could find a way to discredit their religious beliefs, the collapse of Jewish resistance might be even more complete than usual. But if their faith proved more resilient than expected, the siege might prove longer and more costly than his advisors anticipated. The king was confident in his ultimate victory, but he was experienced enough to know that overconfidence was the enemy of good planning. He would prepare for every contingency, bring overwhelming force to bear on the problem, and rely on the military machine that had never yet failed him. As the months of preparation continued, intelligence reports from Jerusalem grew increasingly interesting. The city was clearly preparing for siege, but there were also signs of internal division. Some of Hezekiah's advisors were reportedly arguing for accommodation with Assyria, while others insisted on continued resistance. These divisions might prove crucial when the actual siege began. Sennacherib was particularly intrigued by reports about the prophet Isaiah, who seemed to be promising divine deliverance from the Assyrian threat. Such religious figures could be either assets or liabilities to a defending city. If their prophecies failed to materialize, they could trigger a collapse of morale. But if circumstances could be interpreted as fulfilling their predictions, they might strengthen resistance beyond all reasonable expectation. The king made a mental note to pay special attention to religious developments within Jerusalem during the siege. The capture or elimination of key religious figures might prove as important as the capture of the city's military leaders. As winter turned to spring and spring to summer, the preparations for the campaign neared completion. The army had been assembled, the siege equipment constructed, and the supply trains organized. Intelligence from Jerusalem indicated that Hezekiah remained defiant, and that the city was as prepared as it could be for the coming assault. Sennacherib reviewed his plans one final time, consulting with his generals about every detail of the operation. The siege of Jerusalem would be the crowning achievement of his reign, the victory that would secure his place in history as the conqueror who had finally eliminated the last vestige of Jewish independence. He could not have imagined that this campaign, which he approached with such confidence and careful preparation, would become not the greatest triumph of his career, but rather an encounter with forces that lay entirely outside his understanding of how the world worked. The military machine that had never failed him was about to face its first and most devastating defeat, though the nature of that defeat would be unlike anything recorded in the annals of warfare. Yet Hezekiah could not bring himself to surrender. It was not merely a matter of political pride or personal courage, though both played a role in his decision. Rather, it was a profound conviction that his kingdom existed not merely as a political entity, but as a covenant community bound governed by sacred obligations that transcended ordinary considerations of military strategy. The angel of the Lord strikes Assyria. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the palace corridors echoed only with the footsteps of guards and the distant sound of temple prayers, Hezekiah made his way to the most sacred place in his kingdom. The Temple of Solomon rose before him in the pre-dawn darkness, its massive stones seeming to absorb and reflect the starlight in patterns that spoke of divine architecture beyond human understanding. The king had dismissed his bodyguards at the outer court, choosing to approach his God alone as David had done centuries before, when faced with his own moments of crisis. The weight of the crown seemed heavier with each step, not because of its gold and precious stones, but because of the responsibility it represented. Every soul in Jerusalem, every family in Judah looked to him for protection that he could not provide through human means. The court of the priests was empty at this hour, save for the eternal flame that burned upon the altar of burnt offering. The bronze basin gleamed in the firelight, and the pillars of Jachin and Boaz stood like silent sentinels, guarding the entrance to the holy place. Here, in this space that his ancestor Solomon had dedicated to the worship of the Most High, Hezekiah fell prostrate upon the stone floor. His prayer began not with requests, but with remembrance, for he understood that faith must be grounded in the demonstrated character of God, rather than in human hopes or fears. O Lord God of Israel, who dwells between the cherubim, he whispered, his voice barely audible in the vast sacred space. You alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. You made the heavens and the earth. The words came slowly at first, drawn from the depths of a heart that had been shaped by years of study in the sacred texts and decades of seeking to govern according to divine principles. But as he continued to pray, the words began to flow more freely, as if the very act of acknowledging God's sovereignty was opening channels of communication that had been blocked by anxiety and human reasoning. You are the God who brought our fathers out of Egypt with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Hezekiah continued, his voice growing stronger as his confidence in God's character deepened. You are the God who gave them this land, who established your temple in this place, who made covenant promises that cannot be broken. He recalled the stories that had been passed down through generations, each one a testament to divine faithfulness in impossible circumstances, Abraham's willingness to sacrifice Isaac, and God's provision of a substitute, Moses' confrontation with Pharaoh, and the plagues that brought the mighty Egyptian empire to its knees, Joshua's conquest of the Promised Land, when city after city fell before the Ark of the Covenant, David's victory over Goliath, when a shepherd's faith proved mightier than a warrior's strength. These were not merely ancient tales to Hezekiah, but living proofs of God's power and willingness to intervene in human history. Each story was a promise that the same God who had acted in the past could act again in the present. That divine power was not limited by human understanding or constrained by natural law. As he prayed, Hezekiah spread before the Lord the threatening letter that had arrived from Sennacherib's advance forces. The parchment sealed with the royal seal of Assyria contained demands that were both insulting and terrifying. It mocked the God of Israel as powerless to save, comparing him to the gods of other nations that had fallen before Assyrian might. It described in vivid detail what would happen to Jerusalem if resistance continued, promising destruction so complete that future generations would struggle to remember that a city had ever existed on this site. Truly, Lord, Hezekiah prayed, his voice breaking with emotion, the kings of Assyria have laid waste to the nations and their lands, and have cast their gods into the fire. For they were not gods, but the work of men's hands, wood and stone. Therefore they destroyed them. This acknowledgment was crucial to Hezekiah's faith. He understood that the Assyrian victories over other nations proved nothing about their power relative to the God of Israel, because those other nations had been trusting in idols that possessed no real existence or authority. The comparison was fundamentally invalid, like comparing the shadow of a mountain to the mountain itself. But now, O Lord our God, the king continued, his voice rising with passionate intensity, I beseech you, save us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you are the Lord God, you alone. This prayer was not motivated by narrow nationalism or political calculation. Hezekiah was not asking God to preserve Judah simply because it was his kingdom, or because he desired to maintain his throne. Rather, he was appealing to God's own glory and reputation among the nations. If the God of Israel allowed his people to be destroyed by pagans who openly mocked his name, what would the nations conclude about his power and faithfulness? The request was bold in its theological implications. Hezekiah was essentially asking God to demonstrate his uniqueness and supremacy in such a dramatic way that all the world would be forced to acknowledge his authority. This was not a small favor between allies, but a request for divine intervention on a scale that would reshape the ancient world's understanding of spiritual reality. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the temple courts, Hezekiah remained prostrate before the altar. The physical posture was important to him, representing not just humility, but complete dependence upon divine mercy. He was laying aside all pretense of human strength or wisdom, and acknowledging that only God could deliver Judah from the approaching catastrophe. His prayers were interrupted by the soft sound of sandals on stone. Without raising his head, he recognized the distinctive walk of Isaiah the prophet, whose presence in the temple at this hour could only mean that God had sent him with a word for the crisis. The prophet's arrival felt like an answer to prayer even before any words were spoken. Isaiah was a man who had walked with God for more than 4 decades, having received his calling in the year that King Uzziah died. He had seen kings rise and fall, had witnessed the destruction of the northern kingdom of Israel, had proclaimed God's word through prosperity and adversity. His presence carried an authority that had nothing to do with political position and everything to do with his intimate relationship with the divine. "Rise, O king," Isaiah said gently, his voice carrying the calm assurance of one who had just been in the presence of God. "The Lord has heard your prayer concerning Sennacherib, king of Assyria." Hezekiah lifted his head, and Isaiah could see in the king's face the marks of a night spent in earnest prayer. The royal countenance showed neither despair nor false confidence, but rather the deep peace that comes from having placed an impossible burden in hands capable of bearing it. "Thus says the Lord," Isaiah continued, his voice taking on the distinctive cadence that marked him as a spokesman for the divine, concerning the king of Assyria. "He shall not come into this city, nor shoot an arrow there, nor come before it with shield, nor build a siege mound against it." The words were so specific, so contrary to all human expectation, that they could only have come from a source beyond natural knowledge. Every intelligence report, every military assessment, every reasonable projection indicated that Sennacherib's forces were already moving toward Jerusalem with the clear intention of besieging the city. Yet God was declaring through his prophet that not only would the siege fail, but that it would never even begin. "By the way that he came by, the same shall he return," Isaiah prophesied, "and shall not come into this city, says the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for my servant David's sake." The reference to David was profoundly significant. Centuries earlier, God had made covenant promises to David about his dynasty and about the city where the temple stood. These promises had seemed to be in jeopardy as Assyrian power expanded throughout the region. But how God was reaffirming his commitment to honor the covenant regardless of human circumstances. Hezekiah felt a transformation taking place within his spirit as he listened to Isaiah's words. The crushing weight of impossible responsibility was being lifted from his shoulders, not because the external situation had changed, but because he was remembering whose kingdom Judah really was. He was not the ultimate ruler of this land, but merely a steward of divine authority, and the God who had appointed him was perfectly capable of defending his own interests. "What of the people?" Hezekiah asked. "How shall I prepare them for what is to come?" Isaiah's response revealed the practical wisdom that always accompanied true prophecy. Divine intervention did not negate human responsibility, but rather provided the context within which faithful action became meaningful. "Let the people know that their God has not forgotten them," the prophet replied. "Let them continue their prayers, their sacrifices, their obedience to the covenant, but let them also prepare for siege as prudent men would do for God's miracles, often work through natural means as well as supernatural ones." This guidance struck the perfect balance between faith and wisdom. The people should trust in God's promise of deliverance, but they should also take reasonable precautions against the coming danger. Faith did not require irresponsibility, and divine protection did not eliminate the value of human preparation. As Isaiah departed, Hezekiah remained in the temple for several more hours, his prayer now transformed from desperate petition to grateful worship. The change in his spiritual condition was profound and lasting. Where there had been anxiety, there was now peace. Where there had been confusion, there was now clarity of purpose. Where there had been the weight of impossible responsibility, there was now the confidence of one who serves a God for whom nothing is impossible. The king's transformation did not go unnoticed by those who served him. When he returned to the palace, His advisors immediately sensed that something fundamental had changed. The man who had entered the temple, burdened with the weight of impending disaster, had returned with the bearing of one who had received assurance from the highest possible authority. General Joah, the commander of Hezekiah's forces, was among the first to notice the change. A career soldier who had served 3 kings, he had learned to read the subtle signs that indicated a ruler's state of mind. What he saw in Hezekiah's face was not the artificial confidence of a man trying to convince himself, but the genuine peace of one who had received reliable information about the outcome of the crisis. "My lord," Joah inquired respectfully, "what word have you received concerning our situation?" Hezekiah's response was measured and deliberate, for he understood that his words would quickly spread throughout the city, and that the morale of the entire kingdom might depend upon how he communicated what had happened. "The Lord has spoken through his prophet Isaiah," the king announced to his assembled counselors. "Assyria will not succeed in its purpose against this city. We are to continue our preparations for siege, for these are matters of prudent governance. But we are also to rest in the assurance that our God will defend Jerusalem for his own name's sake and for the sake of his covenant with David." The reaction to this announcement was mixed as Hezekiah had expected. Some of his advisers, particularly those who had been advocating for accommodation with Assyria, showed obvious skepticism. How could religious faith override military reality? Others, especially those who had witnessed God's faithfulness in previous crises, received the news with relief and gratitude. Eliakim, the palace administrator and one of Hezekiah's most trusted advisors, asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "My lord, how can we be certain that this prophecy is reliable? The consequences of error would be catastrophic for our entire people." It was a fair question, and Hezekiah respected the administrator's prudence. The decision to resist Assyrian pressure based on prophetic assurance rather than military calculation was perhaps the most momentous choice any king of Judah had ever faced. "Isaiah has been God's spokesman for 40 years, Hezekiah replied. "His words have been proven true again and again. When he prophesied the fall of Damascus, it fell. When he predicted the invasion of Israel by Assyria, it happened exactly as he said. When he promised divine judgment upon the nations that oppressed God's people, that judgment came to pass. His record of accuracy is perfect, and his prophecies have never failed." This response addressed the practical concerns of those who needed evidence for faith. Isaiah's credibility was not based merely on his claims to divine revelation, but on decades of demonstrated reliability. His prophecies had been tested by time and circumstance, and they had never been found wanting. But Hezekiah also addressed the deeper issue that underlay his